The summer of 1944 finds Allied airmen, sailors, and soldiers poised for a grand entrance into Europe. Their objective is clear: secure a foothold, advance inland, and liberate the territories under Axis control. However, this isn't the renowned event of June 6, 1944. We are now in mid-August, specifically the 15th, and the colossal fleet heads not to Normandy but towards the sunlit shores of southern France. By this time in the conflict, the Allies are pushing forward across various fronts in Europe. The Normandy campaign progresses, and in Italy, the Allies' strategic point, referred to as the soft underbelly of Nazi Germany, Rome is captured on June 4th. This forces German forces to withdraw further up the Italian peninsula. Nevertheless, progress is not without its hindrances. The combat in Normandy proves to be intense, and in Italy, the difficulty of moving through mountainous landscapes slows Allied forces, with the daunting Alps still presenting a barrier. Commanders realize the need for additional strategies. A promising alternative is southern France's Mediterranean coast. As early as 1943, plans for an invasion, then known as Operation Anvil, were formulated as a potential substitute for the main offensive in Normandy. Although the principal landings occurred further north, the critical ports of Toulon and Marseille presented enticing targets. However, not all Allied leaders supported a second front in southern France. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill opposed the idea, suggesting that forces designated for Anvil could be better utilized advancing through the Ljubljana Gap towards Vienna. This would allow Allied forces access to the Balkans and potentially curb Soviet expansion. Churchill, according to his physician Lord Moran, seemed increasingly preoccupied with the post-war balance of power, warning of communism's spread and dwelling less on Hitler's threat. In contrast, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower focused on concluding the war at hand. With the ports in Normandy strained to capacity, he sought new supply routes and additional forces in France. Supporting Anvil was also Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the French Committee of National Liberation, keen to see French troops active and demanding that a French general command the operation. While the U.S. declined this request, they pledged that French forces would be responsible for liberating Toulon and Marseille, eventually forming a separate army. For the moment, however, the French Army B was under the command of the U.S. 7th Army, yet they planned to prove their mettle and push further north rapidly. In early August, after much deliberation, the British Chiefs of Staff granted approval for what was now termed Operation Dragoon, the name change aiming to maintain operational secrecy, though Churchill humorously remarked he'd been coerced into agreement. The planners examined every detail, even utilizing pre-war tourist photographs for precision. 3 American divisions were to take part in the August 15 assault, backed by several French forces, including numerous African units. Their mission was to establish a secure landing site, fend off the anticipated German retaliation, and capture Toulon and Marseille within 45 days. In 1940, southern France had been part of unoccupied Vichy France until German forces seized complete control in 1942. By 1944, German defenses awaited the Allies. Under General Johannes Blaskowitz, Army Group G held responsibility for this region with approximately 230,000 soldiers, though only a fraction, about 30,000, were stationed where the invasion was expected. The natural ruggedness of the terrain provided a defensive advantage, but Blaskowitz faced uncertainty as to the invasion's precise timing and location. Complicating matters, his best units had been dispatched to Normandy defenses, leaving his forces weakened. By August, over half of his armored reserves had shifted north, where they suffered significant losses in the failed Montana's offensive commencing August 7. Now, the 19th Army, defending the coastline, was a mixture of poorly equipped garrison troops with uneven enthusiasm, stationed in major towns along the coast. German troops lacked transportation and were a mix of volunteers and conscripts from Eastern European nations such as Russia, Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. Some were of German ethnicity, yet this diversity led to issues in unit cohesion and communication. Joseph Kiesner, a Bavarian with the 164th Reserve Grenadier Battalion, recalled that in his company, except for a few older men, they were mostly young boys aged 17 and 18, some from Upper Silesia, who spoke Polish among themselves. These men were likely former POWs with some German ancestry, who were conscripted or volunteered for the German army as an alternative to remaining in detention camps. The single armored unit at the 19th Army's disposal was the 11th Panzer Division, composed partly of veterans from the Eastern Front, well regarded but diminished in strength and numbers. To offset this, German forces had invested in static defenses, extensive minefields, and beach obstacles. Despite these efforts, defenses were stretched thin along the coast, and fortifications were incomplete, sporadic, and separated by gaps. A division officer expressed concern, noting that, with past experiences like the Maginot Line, fortification value was dubious, especially against the backdrop of the Mediterranean, whose defenses were expected to crumble quickly under attack. Until 1942, being assigned to southern France was a perk, offering a picturesque setting for weary German troops to recuperate. However, by 2 years later, the area was overrun with resistance activity. The Allies harnessed this burgeoning resistance for Operation Dragoon. The French resistance was a composite of several factions, boasting about 75,000 members in this territory, though only a third bore arms. Their ranks swelled post-1942, following the instatement of a labor draft serving Germany's war machine. By 1944, these groups effectively controlled rural Provence. Their guerrilla tactics kept German troops confined to fortresses, moving only with large escorts. Resistance leader André Zeller noted that Germans became captives within their strongholds, venturing out primarily for supplies or punitive expeditions, which ended in ambush half the time. Coordination with these local fighters was vital, accomplished through the efforts of the British Special Operations Executive and the American Office of Strategic Services. They facilitated contact with the resistance, with special teams, known as Jedburghs, orchestrating efforts. Simultaneously, operational groups ranging from 15 to 30 men carried out combat missions. Across the region, networks called circuits unraveled, set to gather intelligence, cut communications, and stop the Germans from destroying key docks during Dragoon. Moreover, the resistance was tasked with supporting Allied paratroops preceding the main assault. On Dragoon's eve, August 15th, in the very early hours, American and British paratroopers, including an all-Japanese-American battalion, parachuted near Lemuy, a strategic garrison town lying en routes to the beaches. They were soon followed by heavier units arriving via glider, tasked with stalling German countermeasures against the initial assault. Yet, despite meticulous planning, things did not commence smoothly. Dense fog obscured the drop locations, and only around 40% of troops landed as intended. This, ironically, worked to their advantage as Germans overestimated the operation's scope, restricting their response. British and American forces, linking with local resistance, carried out spontaneous raids sowing chaos. For instance, they encircled and isolated the headquarters of German General Ferdinand Neuling's 62nd Corps. Meanwhile, naval commandos undertook missions to disrupt defenses, leading the way for the upcoming major invasion. Allied forces, including Canada's 1st Special Service Force and the French African Commando Group, launched attacks on German artillery placements on Ile-d'Yeu. The French commandos established a barricade close to Capneg, with both airborne and naval attackers experiencing minimal losses. However, the Germans managed to capture members of the French Naval Assault Commandos in a minefield at Frere Point. Journalist Homer Bigart from the New York Herald Tribune was present to document an attack on Port Cole. Reverting to guerrilla methods, 3 groups of volunteer raiders painted their faces and silently approached Lavon and Ile depots by paddling in inflatable boats. These troops, adept at mountain warfare, navigated rocky cliffs under the cover of night, pushing through dense undergrowth to emerge onto a path leading to fortified enemy positions guarding the only landing site accessible to their vessels. The precursor strikes on August 14th and 15th laid the groundwork for the primary assault. By 8 a.m. on August 15th, the 3 main Allied infantry divisions had gathered offshore. The landings were executed at 3 distinct sites named Alpha, Delta, and Camel, situated between Fresu and Cavalier-sur-Mer. With concerns focused on mines due to extensive German defensive placements, including naval and land mines as well as rigged obstructions, the Allies employed 140 minesweepers. Additionally, the U.S. Navy deployed radio-controlled Apex drone vessels loaded with 3.6 metric tons of explosives. These craft were intended to crash into obstacles, but their dependability was questionable. One rogue Apex nearly caused disaster for an Allied landing craft. A colossal bombardment by Allied naval and air forces took place just before the landings, supported by a formidable fleet of 900 vessels, among them the U.S. battleship Texas. Crewman Bob Ferris remembered the impact of the Texas's first salvo. The force was so strong that pants billowed as if caught in a gale. Smaller rocket-carrying landing vessels and fighter bombers from escort carriers struck the beaches with a barrage of rockets as the hour for the landing approached. As the troops landed at Alpha and Delta beaches, German defense proved to be weak, largely due to the preliminary barrage which had wiped out poorly reinforced defenses and silenced enemy guns. Louis Harlan, who touched down at Delta Beach, described the aftermath. A handful of German casualties were visible, along with about 30 prisoners, whereas American losses were minimal. Nearby, a machine gun position revealed fallen German soldiers strewn about like discarded dolls, likely struck by naval fire before any U.S. personnel reached land. In contrast, most American casualties stemmed not from enemy fire, but from mines. However, not every beach witnessed such an easy advance. In the Camel sector, Camel Red Beach posed significant challenges due to its location on the Gulf of Faygeau. Potential landing sites were restricted by geography, including cliffs and a harbor. The few beaches available were heavily fortified with obstacles such as mines, tank traps, and barbed wire, alongside a deep anti-tank trench and artillery. The town was fortified, too, with large 220mm guns. Camel Red was also strategically crucial because two vital roads converged there, and a German airbase was nearby. As Allied minesweepers neared the shores, they were forced to retreat under German artillery fire before completing their objectives. The initial bombardment had little impact on these defenses, and when amphibious craft readied to land as planned at 2 p.m., they anticipated high casualties. At the last moment, U.S. moment, Admiral Spencer Lewis ordered the Camel Red Group to land at Camel Green instead, a location already cleared. Although this decision delayed the capture of Frazier Airfield, as noted by U.S. 6th Corps Commander General Lucian Truscott, it probably prevented severe loss of life. Only one significant Luftwaffe success emerged that day. A single German Dornier Doe 217, likely stationed at the airfield, launched an HS-293 guided bomb, sinking landing ship Tank 282, and resulting in 40 Allied casualties. Lieutenant Lawrence Gilbert witnessed the event and reported seeing a bright rocket-shaped object beneath a twin-engine, twin-rudder plane. The projectile then turned sharply, heading toward its target with flames and smoke trailing. While Truscott was critical of the decision to alter landing plans, historians suggest that it ultimately preserved many lives. Capturing the airfield sooner by attacking Camel Red would not have been feasible, as it took engineers several days to dismantle the defenses, even after the beach fell from the land side. Once ashore, Allied forces quickly reached out to paratroopers and set up blockades on primary routes. Anticipating German counterattacks, they found resistance surprisingly scant. Seeing this as an opportunity, Allied divisions advanced, securing Le Marine. Meanwhile, French forces commenced their landings 5 days earlier than initially planned. The invasion threw the German forces into disarray. Cut off from effective communication, confirmation of the invasion only reached German command mid-morning on D-Day. On August 19th, German counteroffensives were too fragmented and too late to capitalize, quickly dismantled by Allied forces. As German commanders scrambled to redraw defensive maps, they often found their adjustments outpaced by advancing enemy troops. By 4 days post-D-Day, Allied forces had crossed the Durance River, pursuing retreating German soldiers. The German objective now relied on delaying the Allies long enough for the 11th Panzer Division to stabilize their withdrawal from the Rhone Valley. As they retreated, U.S. forces encircled Toulon and Marseille, moving to defend the flanks of French soldiers who eagerly sought to liberate the cities. Under orders from Hitler to fight to the end, The German garrisons struggled against inadequate defenses along with an increasingly rebellious civilian populace. By August 22nd, citizens in Marseille rose against their occupiers, paving the way for French troops to arrive the next day and expel German forces from both cities. Renewed by this local support, French troops pressed on against demoralized German forces despite cautious advice from Allied commanders. On August 23rd, with surrender growing among German troops, Allied forces pressed on. Further north, the 19th German Army made its way to Montélimar, shadowed by the new American Task Force Butler. However, the U.S. advance was hindered by fuel shortages, prioritizing ammunition over fuel in anticipation of a quick German counterattack post-D-Day. Despite logistical struggles, U.S. forces maneuvered into position to cut off German retreat routes within what was dubbed the Montélimar Battle Square, a sprawling 250 square kilometers of rugged terrain interspersed with farmland. Task Force Butler aimed to block escape routes like the N7 highway and Rhone River crossings, but vigorous German counterattacks repeatedly forced them to retreat to elevated positions. Hill 300, Montélimar, and Pré-Saint-Martin became hotbeds of intense combat. Although U.S. forces managed to establish temporary roadblocks, these defenses were not sufficient to hold back persistent German attempts at retreat. Overwhelming artillery fire made German units flee through a gauntlet as they traversed the river crossings, striving for relative safety on the northern banks. Despite intermittent German success in isolated counterattacks, their lack of coordination and intelligence curtailed further exploitation of fragile U.S. positions. On August 28th, Marseille and Toulon's German garrisons finally capitulated, ignoring orders to stand firm. These battles inflicted approximately 5,000 French casualties, capturing 28,000 German soldiers. With German resistance crumbling, reinforcements poured north. The following day, the 19th Army began its final withdrawal, attempting to buy time while rearguard actions sought to slow the advancing U.S. forces. German military units advanced across the Dome and moved north, pressing the retreating Allied troops. On the night of August 30 to 31st, as a violent storm raged, the parish priest chronicled their passage through a small village. The night was tumultuous, with the droning of engines, blaring horns, and the cries of both riders and weary soldiers trudging on foot, drenched and beseeching passing vehicles for a ride. Resistance forces ambushed the columns, resulting in casualties. Frantic German officers demanded an audience with the mayor amidst the chaos and thunder, insisting on 15 hostages by 8 a.m. the following day, with threats to burn the village if resistance actions continued. The German retreat, despite its disorderly nature, proved largely successful. The Americans managed to destroy some of the German rear units. However, a significant portion, including 75% of the 11th Panzer Division, managed to slip away to the north. The Battle of Montélimar and the subsequent liberation of Marseille and Toulon signaled the effective conclusion of Operation Dragoon. The Allied Dragoon forces continued northwards, capturing Lyon and eventually uniting with Eisenhower's armies by September 19th. Historian Samuel Morrison described Dragoon as an unparalleled success, noting minimal casualties. He viewed it as nearly flawless regarding the coordination and execution between the Army, Navy, and Air Force, drawing on and refining tactics used in earlier operations like Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy. Charles de Gaulle's status was significantly bolstered by Dragoon. Previously sidelined during Operation Overlord, French forces played a vital role in their country's liberation. This involvement culminated in the creation of the First French Army, enhancing de Gaulle's political standing and legitimacy. Nonetheless, missed opportunities arose. If French armored divisions had been positioned to block the north rather than focusing on ports, they might have effectively trapped the Germans at Montélimar. Allied improvisation led to rapid advances, but also caused miscommunication and hesitance, especially at Montélimar. It's debated whether the Allies could have overcome their logistic and fuel shortages to achieve a faster advance. Military analysts and historians have discussed Dragoon's impact on the overall Allied victory. Field Marshal Montgomery controversially suggested reallocating Dragoon forces to Normandy, positing that the Western Allies might have reached Berlin ahead of the Soviets. However, This seems unlikely, as northern French ports were already stretched supplying the existing Allied forces. In contrast, Marseille eventually became a critical supply hub, handling 26% of all supplies entering Europe and supporting the deployment of 500,000 additional troops. Ultimately, Operation Dragoon underscored the downfall of German forces in France. After setbacks at Marseille and the landings, German High Command advised Hitler to retract troops for homeland defense. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front was being overrun by the Soviet Red Army's successful offensive operations. With nearly all of France liberated, conditions were ripe for the final confrontations with the Reich in early 1945. The Western Allies focused on breaching the Rhine, while the Red Army prepared to strike Berlin. The last major Western conflict, the Battle of the Rhineland, was paired with the Eastern Battle of Berlin. Vast Allied contingents marshaled for these final assaults, aiming to topple the Nazi regime and force its last defensive reserves into action. Intrigued by these pivotal battles, we have created extensive World War II documentary series that delve into these events with exhaustive detail and expert commentary. Rhineland 45 explores the intense Lower Rhine conflict, showcasing the largest paratrooper operation in one day of the entire war. Additionally, 16 Days in Berlin methodically chronicles the two-week battle leading to the fall of Berlin, featuring first-hand insights from illustrious guests like Ian from Forgotten Weapons and David Willey from the Tank Museum. Access these series on Nebula, a streaming platform developed in collaboration with fellow creators. Nebula offers freedom from algorithm constraints and advertisements, with revenue directly supporting us. By visiting nebula.tv/realtimehistory and subscribing, you benefit from a 40% discount and early access to ad-free content. Explore our new Nebula original series, Red Atoms, focusing on the Soviet nuclear program, and discover an array of educational classes from Nebula creators. Join Nebula and elevate your historical understanding.